The auction block in Algiers reeks of sweat, salt, and fear. A 19-year-old Italian girl stands naked under the North African sun, her wrists still bleeding from the ropes. Men circle her like wolves. They're calculating, not her humanity, her price. One buyer squeezes her jaw open to inspect her teeth. Another forces her to turn, examining her like livestock. She tries to cover herself. A whip cracks across her back. She's been here 3 days. The voyage took 11. Before that, she was pulling nets with her father off the Sicilian coast. This wasn't fiction. It really happened. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, over 1 million Europeans were enslaved by North African raiders known as the Barbary pirates. The number is conservative. Some historians put it closer to 1.25 million. These weren't military captives from battlefields. They were fishermen's daughters, farmers' wives, nuns dragged from convents, children taken from coastal villages in the dead of night. The Barbary states, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Saleh, operated the largest state-sponsored kidnapping network in early modern history. Their galleys prowled the Mediterranean and beyond. They raided as far north as Iceland. In 1631, they sacked Baltimore, Ireland. Took everyone. Over 100 men, women, and children vanished into the slave markets of North Africa. The village never recovered, but the real horror wasn't the raids. It was what happened after. Women and girls were separated immediately upon capture. The crews knew their value. A healthy young woman could fetch 5 times the price of a male laborer. Beauty increased the price further. Virginity could double it. The corsairs weren't just pirates. They were procurement specialists for a sophisticated trade network that treated human beings as renewable resources. The crossing was designed to break them. Holds packed so tight you couldn't sit. Darkness, the stench of dysentery. Rape was systematic, not frenzied, calculated. The captains allowed it as payment for the crew. Some women were assaulted dozens of times before reaching shore. Pregnant captives were worth less at market. So many were forced to drink mixtures of herbs and seawater to induce miscarriage. Those who resisted were beaten unconscious. Those who fought back were thrown overboard as examples. Father Pierre Dan, a French priest who worked to ransom Christian slaves in the 1630s, documented what he saw. He described women arriving in Algiers in states of such despair and bodily ruin that many could not stand. He recorded that girls as young as 12 were sold specifically to brothels. He wrote that the markets categorized women by age, beauty, and virginity status. There were price charts, standardized, like grain futures. The Ottoman elite purchased the most beautiful. They disappeared into harems, sealed compounds where they would never be seen by the outside world again. Converted to Islam, often by force. Bearing children who would never know their mother's true origins. Some adapted to survive, others didn't. The mortality rate in harems was staggering, not from violence but from disease, childbirth complications, and what the records euphemistically called melancholy. Suicide, in other words. But the harem was the best outcome. Most captured women ended up in households as domestic slaves, washing, cooking, and servicing the sexual demands of whoever owned them. Islamic law technically prohibited the enslavement of Muslims, but conversion didn't guarantee freedom. Masters found theological loopholes. A woman who converted but was deemed insufficiently pious could remain enslaved indefinitely. The system was self-sustaining. Children born to slave women inherited slave status. Entire bloodlines trapped for generations. The truly unlucky went to the bagnios. These were labor prisons where slaves were rented out for construction, galley rowing, or mining. Women in bagnios faced conditions designed for men twice their size. They hauled stones, they dug, and at night, guards had unrestricted access. There were no rules in the bagnios, no oversight. Father Dan described seeing women chained to walls in postures that made rest impossible. He described brandings. He described women whose bodies had been so ruined by forced labor and assault that they no longer appeared human. Pause for a second. We're talking about a system that lasted 3 centuries, 300 years of raids, kidnappings, and sales. This wasn't a fringe operation. It was the economic engine of the Barbary states. Algiers built palaces with ransom money. The day of Algiers, the ruler took a 20% cut of every slave sale. Admirals received bonuses based on the number of captives their fleets delivered. There were official record keepers tracking inventory, human inventory. And Europe knew. They knew the entire time. The Spanish tried paying tribute, protection money to avoid raids. It didn't work. The corsairs took the gold and raided anyway. The French negotiated treaties. The pirates honored them when convenient and ignored them when opportunity arose. The British eventually unleashed naval power, but not out of moral outrage. They did it because American shipping, no longer protected by the British flag after independence, was getting hammered, and it was bad for business. The stories that survived are fragments. A Cornish woman named Elizabeth Marsh was captured in 1756. She managed to write about her experience years later. She described the auction, the inspection, the isolation. She was purchased by a merchant who kept her in a locked room for 2 years. She was one of the lucky ones. She was eventually ransomed. Most never were. Ransoms were big business. Religious orders, the Trinitarians and Mercedarians, were founded specifically to buy back Christian captives. They traveled to North Africa with chests of gold. They haggled. They negotiated. But there was never enough money. For every 1 person ransomed, 10 more arrived in chains, and the orders had to make choices. A nobleman's daughter? Absolutely. A peasant girl from Calabria? Maybe next year. The women who couldn't be ransomed and couldn't adapt faced a simple calculus: survive by submission or die resisting. Most chose survival. That survival meant things no one should have to endure. It meant accepting that your body was property, that your children, if you had them, would be property, that your name, your language, your God, everything that made you yourself, had to be abandoned or hidden so deeply that eventually you'd forget it was ever there. Some didn't forget. There are records of women who maintained Christian faith in secret for decades, who whispered prayers in languages their own children didn't understand, who taught their daughters fragments of songs from villages they would never see again. Acts of resistance so small they barely registered, but in that context, defiance itself. The Barbary slave trade didn't end because of moral awakening. It ended because European naval power grew strong enough to make it unprofitable. The French conquered Algiers in 1830, not to free slaves, to expand empire. The slaves were an afterthought. By then, the trade had been declining for decades, not because of ethics, but because new markets and new technologies made it less lucrative. But here's what's unforgivable. Not just what was done, what was forgotten. There are no monuments to the women of the Barbary slave trade, no museums. The stories are buried in obscure historical texts that most people will never read. We talk about other slave trades, and we should, but this one vanished from collective memory. Why? Because it complicates narratives. Because it doesn't fit neatly into the moral frameworks we use to organize history. Because acknowledging it requires confronting the fact that human cruelty doesn't belong to one culture, one religion, one race. It belongs to power, and power will always find a way to justify what it wants to take. The women who died in those markets, in those harems, in those bagnios, they're gone. Their names are gone. Their faces are gone. All that remains are scattered records written by men who saw them as problems to be solved or commodities to be traded. And that might be the worst part. Not that it happened, that we let it disappear. But they weren't the only ones forgotten. There were men in those markets too, tens of thousands of them. And what happened to them? The galleys, the quarries, the psychological warfare designed to break human beings into obedient tools, that's a different kind of nightmare. One we'll have to explore next, because history's darkest chapters are rarely written. They're buried, and someone has to dig them up. The galley deck is 40 meters of splintered wood and human misery, 24 oars per side, 5 men chained to each oar. They've been rowing for 16 hours straight, no breaks, no water since dawn. The man in the front position, the one who sets the rhythm, collapsed an hour ago. He's still chained to the oar, still moving, because the 4 men behind him are pulling his weight, dragging his limp body back and forth with each stroke. If they stop, the whip comes, so his corpse rows. The overseer doesn't care that he's dead. He'll care tonight when they unchain the bodies and throw them overboard. Right now, the Algerian corsair galley is chasing a Venetian merchant ship, and speed is all that matters. This wasn't an exception, it was standard procedure. Male European captives faced a different kind of destruction than the women. Not sexual slavery, though that happened too. Something more methodical. The Barbary states needed labor, massive amounts of labor, to build fortifications, to row galleys, to construct the very infrastructure that would enable more raids, more captives, more profit. They needed men who could work until they died and then be immediately replaced. The system was efficient, terrifyingly efficient. Men were sorted at the docks based on physical capability. The young and strong went to the galleys or construction gangs. Skilled tradesmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, masons were retained for specialized work. The old, the weak, the injured from the voyage, they went to the quarries. Life expectancy in the quarries was measured in months. You cut stone in North African heat with minimal food and no medical care until your body gave out. Then you were left where you fell. But the galleys were worse, much worse. A galley slave's life was measured in strokes. Each rowing session could last 8, 12, sometimes 20 hours depending on pursuit or escape. You were chained by the ankle to a bench that you shared with 4 other men. The chain was just long enough to let you reach the oar. Not long enough to stand fully. Not long enough to lie down. You sat, you pulled, you sat, you pulled. The rhythm was enforced by overseers with whips and sometimes heated irons for men who fell behind. Father Pierre Dan, the same priest who documented the women's suffering, spent time observing the galleys. He wrote that the men were reduced to the state of beasts of burden, without speech, without hope, their bodies covered in sores that never heal due to the constant friction of the ore and the salt water. He noted that many went blind from the glare of sun on water, that their hands fused around the ore handles, the skin growing over the wood, that their spines curved from the unnatural repetitive motion until they couldn't stand upright even when given the chance. Sleep happened at the ore. You leaned forward onto the man in front of you or slumped to the side. Maybe 4 hours a night. Often less. The smell was unbearable. Human waste, rotting flesh from untreated wounds, sweat, vomit. The hold beneath the rowing deck where they kept you when not rowing was worse. No light, no air circulation. Bodies packed so tight that men died in the night and no one noticed until morning because there was no room for them to fall. Diego de Haedo, a Spanish Benedictine who was held captive in Algiers in the 1580s, wrote an account called Topography and General History of Algiers. He described the moment new captives first saw the galleys. Many, he wrote, wept openly, having understood their fate. Others went mad immediately, speaking in tongues or babbling like children. The overseers laughed at this, saying the galley would cure them of sensitivity soon enough. He was right. The galley did cure them of everything. Men who survived the first year underwent a psychological transformation. They stopped speaking unless spoken to, stopped making eye contact, stopped thinking beyond the next stroke. It was a survival mechanism. Hope was the enemy. Hope made you think about escape, about home, about the life you'd lost. That thinking made the pain worse, so you killed it. You became mechanical, reflexive, an organic component of the ship's propulsion system. Some tried to resist. There are records of mutinies. They almost never succeeded. The overseers were armed. The captives were chained and malnourished. But more than that, the system was designed to prevent collective action. Captives were mixed deliberately. Spaniards chained next to Italians next to Frenchmen. Language barriers made coordination nearly impossible. And there was always the question of informants. Turn in a mutiny plot and you might earn better food, a reduced sentence, maybe even freedom. That last part was a lie, usually, but desperate men believe lies. Pause for a second. The economic logic here is important. A galley slave cost money to acquire, but almost nothing to maintain. Feed them just enough to row. Work them until they break, replace them with the next raid. The Barbary states ran the numbers. They calculated the exact minimum caloric intake needed to sustain rowing capacity. They tested different punishment methods to find which produced compliance without reducing productivity. This was industrial-scale human exploitation centuries before the term existed. And the psychological component was deliberate. Break their identity. Emmanuel Duranda, a Flemish captive who escaped in 1640, wrote about the renaming process. Christian names were forbidden. You were given a number or a mocking Arabic name. You were forced to perform Islamic prayers whether you converted or not. The goal wasn't religious conversion. It was erasure. If you have no name, no God, no past, you can't organize, can't rebel, can't even conceive of yourself as human. Some converted genuinely, turned Turk, as it was called, adopted Islam, adopted Arabic names, and joined Barbary society. A few became corsairs themselves. This enraged European observers, but from a survival standpoint, it made perfect sense. Stay Christian and row until you die, or convert and maybe, possibly, gain a path to freedom, or at least reduced suffering. Most conversions happened after years of captivity when every other hope had been exhausted. But conversion didn't guarantee freedom. Masters frequently reneged on promises. Islamic law said Muslims couldn't be enslaved, but in practice, recent converts were kept in bondage under various pretexts. Your faith isn't strong enough yet. You still owe labor for your purchase price. Legal fictions that kept men enslaved despite playing by the rules they'd been given. The ones who maintained Christianity did so quietly. Whispered prayers, hidden symbols. There are accounts of men scratching crosses into the wood of their rowing benches with fingernails, of captives baptizing each other in seawater when the overseers weren't watching. Tiny acts of spiritual resistance that provided psychological armor against total annihilation. Not that it helped physically. The body breaks regardless of faith. Medical care was non-existent. Injuries from rowing, crushed fingers, dislocated shoulders, herniated spines went untreated. Infections were common. Gangrene was a death sentence. If you couldn't row, you were worthless. The Barbary states didn't waste resources on the dying. You were unchained, dragged to a corner, and left. If you recovered on your own, fine. If not, your body was dumped overboard or buried in unmarked mass graves outside the city walls. Disease swept through the galleys regularly. Typhus, dysentery, plague. In enclosed spaces with no sanitation, contagion spread instantly. Emmanuel Duranda described an outbreak in 1637 that killed over 300 galley slaves in a single week. The bodies were thrown into the harbor. He wrote that the water turned dark and the smell lingered for months, but the Barbary corsairs barely noticed. Supply was endless. Every summer brought new raids, new coasts, new villages. The demographics didn't matter. Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, even English and Irish. They all rode the same. They all died the same. The ransom system for men functioned differently than for women. Women were often ransomed quickly if families could pay. Men languished for years. Why? Because the labor value was higher. A strong rower could generate profit for a decade. Why sell him for a lump sum when you could extract years of work? Masters calculated the present value of future labor versus immediate ransom payment. Economics, not mercy, determined who went free. Religious orders tried. The Trinitarians and Mercedarians negotiated constantly, but they were overwhelmed. Father Dan estimated that during his time in Algiers in the 1630s, there were over 25,000 Christian captives in the city alone. His order could ransom maybe 200 per year if they had a good fundraising season. The math was hopeless. Some captives were held specifically for ransom: nobles, wealthy merchants, ship captains. They were kept in slightly better conditions because damaged goods fetched lower prices. But better is relative. They weren't rowing, but they were still prisoners, still subject to beatings, psychological torture, and the constant fear that their families wouldn't or couldn't pay. And families often couldn't. Ransoms were set deliberately high. A laborer's family might need to sell everything they owned: land, livestock, tools, to raise the amount. And even then, it might not be enough. Letters from captives begging for ransoms are heartbreaking. Men writing to wives and children they hadn't seen in years, pleading, promising anything, knowing the letters might never arrive, or that the answer might be no. The ones who accepted they'd never be ransomed faced a choice: die slowly on the oar, or try to escape. Escape attempts were rare and almost always fatal. Algiers was a fortress city. The galleys were guarded. Captives were malnourished and chained. Where would you even go? The desert stretched for hundreds of miles. You didn't speak the language, didn't know the terrain. Recapture meant torture and execution as an example to others. But some tried anyway. Diego de Haedo recorded multiple escape attempts during his captivity. One involved a group of Spanish captives who overpowered a guard and stole a small boat. They made it 15 miles before being caught. They were impaled on stakes along the harbor as a warning, left to die over the course of days while other captives were forced to watch. Another attempt involved tunneling. A group of men dug for months, working at night with their hands and stolen tools. They got within meters of breaching the city wall when an informant sold them out. The entire group was burned alive in the public square. Thomas Pellow, an English cabin boy captured in 1715 at age 11, spent 23 years in Moroccan captivity. He eventually escaped and wrote a memoir. He described watching a failed escape attempt where the captured men were tied to cannons and blown apart. The sight, he wrote, was so horrid that several of us fell sick, and I myself could not eat for 3 days after. Yet despite the risks, the attempts continued, because for some men, death in pursuit of freedom was preferable to life in chains. Others took a different route. Collaboration. The Barbary states incentivized it. Turn informant and get better food. Betray an escape plot and get moved off the galleys. Some European captives became overseers themselves, managing other slaves. They are despised by their fellow captives but had better survival odds. Moral compromises in exchange for a few more years of life. The brutality wasn't mindless, it was calculated. The Barbary states understood that terror was a control mechanism. Public executions, random punishments, unpredictable violence. It kept the captive population docile, too afraid to organize, too traumatized to think clearly, and it worked for 300 years. The trade started declining in the late 18th century, not because of moral evolution, but because European naval power became overwhelming. The United States fought 2 wars, the Barbary Wars of 1801 and 1815, specifically because American ships were being seized and American sailors enslaved. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams had tried paying tribute. It didn't work. Military force did. But even after European powers had the capability to end the trade, they didn't act immediately. Why? Because it was expensive and politically complicated. Easier to pay tribute and ransom the occasional captive than commit to sustained military intervention. The suffering of galley slaves wasn't enough to justify the cost. Not until national pride and economic interests aligned. When the French finally invaded Algiers in 1830, they found thousands of captives still in chains. Some had been there for decades. Some had forgotten their native languages. Some didn't want to leave because they had nothing to return to. Families dead, homes gone, identities erased. The French didn't free them out of compassion. They freed them as a propaganda tool. Look at the barbarism we're ending. Look at the civilization we're bringing. Never mind that France itself had been complicit through treaties and tribute for centuries. Never mind that the invasion was about colonialism, not liberation. And here's the unforgivable part. The men who survived, who made it home after years or decades, weren't welcomed as heroes. They were damaged goods. too broken to readjust, haunted by what they'd endured and what they'd done to survive. Many ended up destitute, begging, alcoholic, driven mad by memories that wouldn't fade. Their stories were buried. Too uncomfortable, too complicated, easier to forget. But forgetting doesn't erase, it just ensures repetition. The systems that enabled the Barbary slave trade, dehumanization, economic exploitation, state-sponsored terror, they didn't die in 1830. They evolved, found new forms, new victims, new justifications. And that pattern, that human capacity to industrialize suffering and then forget it ever happened, that's the real horror. Next time we go even darker, to a place where the cruelty wasn't economic, where it wasn't even rational, where an entire civilization built monuments to torture itself, and the screams echoed for 1,000 years.